Will everyone take a moment and turn off their mobile devices? I'm Diana Ingram, and I'm the executive director here at Hill Center at the Old Naval Hospital. And we are so pleased to welcome Diana Parsell, who has written the world's most appropriate book for Washington, D.C., Where Did Those Cherry Trees Come From? And holy cow, it's Women's History Month, and it was a female journalist. Moderated in conversation with Stephanie Deutsch, who is a renowned member of the Capitol Hill community, a journalist in her own right, and author of a really fascinating book that she presented here at Hill Center on Booker T. Washington, Julius Rosenwald, and schools in the segregated South. And it was a really interesting talk, which I believe lives on our YouTube channel. So we are taping this presentation, and it will be able to be streamed on our YouTube channel later for all those people who signed up and alas did not manage to make it. But anyway, thank you very much. Diana and Stephanie will be in conversation, and then afterwards East City Books is here with books, and Diana will sign the books, and it looks like she has some really nice bookmarks to also give away. So thank you very much.
Hello, hello. Is that okay? Yeah?
Hello? Do I have to press the button? Okay. Well, Diana and I have been talking for the last hour, and I have 500 things to ask her. The book is so interesting, and it is, as Diana Ingram said, so appropriate for this day, for right now, because the cherry blossoms have been with us this week. We've been thinking about them. Lots of us have gone down to see them. But there's so much more in this book than just the cherry blossoms. And Diana is a journalist, an editor, a traveler. She's worked for the National Geographic. She has a strong connection to Washington, D.C. She's the perfect person to write this book. So Diana, how did you get to this story, or how did it find you?
The story definitely did find me, and it wasn't here in D.C., which is remarkable, because I was living about 20 years ago in Jakarta with my husband. He was on a diplomatic assignment, and I bought a book. It was the reprint of an 1897 book called Java, the Garden of the East, published in 1897. And it just had the initials of the author, E.R. Scidmore. I carried that book home. I never read it at the time, but I found it on my desk, my office shelf 10 or 12 years ago, and I picked it up and I dipped into it, and I was immediately engrossed. It made me nostalgic for the places I'd visited, but I was also quite impressed with the writing and the description and the voice of the narrator, and I thought, who was this guy? What took him out to Indonesia 100 years ago? And when I went online, I found these brief facts about this woman named Eliza Scidmore, that she had been a journalist, she'd been the author of these books, 7 books of travel, that she had been the first woman elected to the board of the National Geographic Society in 1892. Then the kicker, I read that she is widely credited as the person who brought the idea of the cherry trees to Washington. And I said, I have lived here 30 years. I have never heard of this woman. So that took me to the Library of Congress and what began the research for the book.
So once you found Eliza, what were the challenges? Was there a lot about her?
There wasn't much, and what's interesting is the National Park Service mentions her as the idea person behind the trees. It's kind of all over the place that she is credited. But when I tried to find information about her at the library, I found copies of her books. I found her listed in about 24 biographical indexes, which told me she was very important in her day. I found a handful of her journalism, nothing about her personal life. And so this tells me why her story, I think there was some evidence Geographic had tried to write her story. I found some notes in their archives, but I think they hit a brick wall. They hit a wall and did not have the information. So it was the digging that I was able then to do. I found a master's thesis that a distant cousin had written many years ago about her. The big breakthrough was at the Library of Congress. It came well into my research that I was doing searches, finding a handful of her journalism because I did not know she wrote her early journalism under a pen name. Ruhama, her middle name and her grandmother's name. And when I plugged that keyword into the searches in the databases at the library, I ended up finding over 800 newspaper and magazine articles she wrote. So of course, you know, this is not just her words and her accounts, but it's datelines. It told me where she was traveling and what time. So now suddenly, for the first time, I can create a chronology of her life. So that was really the breakthrough.
Just trade mics for getting interference on this one. Okay.
Okay. Well, this is, yeah.
That sounds better, yeah. So, okay, so let's talk about her life. She came to D.C. as a child. Can you talk a little bit about that, about how she was here in our city during the Civil War?
Born in the Midwest. She was born in Iowa. She spent her first few years in Wisconsin because her mother's family settled there in 1848, the year Wisconsin became a state. And the reason she ended up in D.C., from what I can gather, is that Mama had a little bit of a checkered past. Mama was married 3 times. The first one, she was widowed. And then I read in my notes, for I think in this family history, well, the second marriage lasted only a year because he died. Well, I'm finding the guy's name out west, so I know there's something weird there. I never could find it quite until I eventually, a couple years into my research, I'm doing, I don't know, searching for something, and this pops up, the evidence of Mama's divorce in something like 1850. Well, that was a real breakthrough because then she had a third marriage to Eliza's father, and in the middle of the Civil War, they separated. I could not find the reasons for why they split, but he went west, he served in the military, spent the rest of his life out west. Mama comes to D.C. in the middle of the Civil War with a 5-year-old daughter and her 7-year-old son. So she got a job working for the federal government in the Treasury Department, and she took in boarders. So this was a very enterprising woman. I think she came here because Washington was full of job opportunities. She needed to support her family, but she also wanted to get out of Dodge, I think, as I put it, because I think she needed a fresh start.
I loved some of the glimpses we got of Eliza as a child. Tell us about her getting the autograph of Abraham Lincoln.
Yes, she got Abraham Lincoln's autograph. She tells the story. Her mother volunteered during the Civil War at the hospital that was down in the middle of the mall, Union Square. And so there's some, I found some information on that. And also, according to a member of the family in the records, she and her brother would play around the White House area, and that they would watch Abe Lincoln coming and going on his horse because they were living out there at the cottage, and that they approached him and asked for his autograph. So I found that autograph. She and her brother both had autograph books, and his is up in Chicago, and hers ended up, I found online, it's sold at auction, and I don't know who the buyer was, but it was online long enough for me to be able to photograph it. So,
And didn't she then get Andrew Johnson?
I was just going to say, that's the interesting thing, because she has Abe Lincoln, and it says, your friend, to Miss Lily Scidmore, your friend, A. Lincoln, and then underneath that signature is Andrew Johnson's signature. So this just kind of tells you the enterprise and the connection she was making, because there were 75 famous people in that autograph book.
Another great Washington detail that I loved is she went to Georgetown visitation.
Yes. And there's a lovely story from that. I found that she went to Georgetown visitation at least 2 years. And I found the academic records, and the first grade, at the end of first grade, she won 2 prizes. One of them was called orthography. I guess it's the rules of spelling and writing and things. The second one was geography. And she told an interviewer later in life, she said the favorite playthings as a child were maps and a globe. She said, I always was making up journeys. My daydreams were always of other countries. So now already we are beginning to see the seeds of this curious child who wants to grow up and know the world.
So how did she get started as a traveler?
Well, she started her career as a journalist here in Washington. She, at the age of 19, broke into newspaper work, and she went to the Philadelphia Centennial, which was the biggest event America had ever had, of its kind, and she wrote about it. She covered it, and I found a wonderful illustration of that. It was published in a magazine that shows the crowds on the day that President Grant dedicated the opening of that, and she is there in that crowd. I can't see her, but I know she's in that crowd because she wrote about it. She wrote for a newspaper here in Washington, and she wrote 5 articles over the next 7 days reporting on the fair. And so this is the beginning of her journalism record. And I found out later through city directories, her older half-brother, he was 13 years older, he was working as a journalist on that paper. He was a senior editor. So now we can kind of put the dots together and know how she got her start. But then she would stay in Washington during the social season, report on social events, but then she started spending the off months traveling. So she traveled around the country writing articles for this newspaper in St.
Can you recreate the scene we were talking about downstairs of her with the train?
Oh, yes, the train. And this is the second year. She breaks into journalism in 1876. In 1877, I found one of her, it was such a joy to read her newspaper accounts. So she goes west, and she's going out to Indian country. And there's a scene where she is on the train. She's describing traveling across the Great Plains, and she's with another companion. She doesn't ever say who she's traveling with, sometimes her mother, sometimes friends. But there's a scene in it where they have some military, a friend or escort or whatever. He takes her to meet the engineer, and she expresses an interest in riding on the cowcatcher. And he takes off his military jacket, and the engineer puts a cushion on the cowcatcher. And she and her companion ride 40 miles across the plain on the front of this train. So
with their skirts billowing in the
we were, Steph and I were saying, if there's ever a movie, this is the opening shot.
Yeah, quite a something to think about. So, how did she get to Japan?
She went to Japan in 1885 because her brother was posted there as a consular officer. And he went on to spend most of his career, almost 39 years, in Japan and the Far East. So she went out there to visit him with her mother. She had just published her first book, which was a book based on her travels to Alaska. So that was her first big destination. So now she's going to Japan, and this is the second big milestone in her travels. So she goes out, they visit him. Mama stays on and lives with the son for the next 35 years. And Eliza suddenly has a part-time home in Japan. So she came and went for almost 40 years, writing about Japan, became one of the most informed Americans on Japan, wrote a book, lots of articles, and then, of course, that's where she got the idea for the cherry trees.
Speaking of the cherry trees, tell us about the Washington Monument.
Yeah. I was telling Stephanie this because, I was mentioning that I loved reading these newspaper accounts of hers. And one of them, her Alaska, she had just gone to her first trip to Alaska in the summer of 1883. She comes back to Washington. She obviously has a column to write. So she goes down to the National Mall. The Washington Monument is still under construction. It's about a year away from being completed, but they have just started filling in that swampy ground behind the Washington Monument where the Potomac River used to come right up to the base of the monument because these were mud flats. So the tide would come in, roll right into the base of the monument, and then it would flow out, and it left a big smelly, stinky, marshy area. She goes down there because I think she needs something to report on. She wants to report on the beginnings of this project. She goes up to the top of the Washington Monument, riding the platform elevator that the workmen used to carry the stone materials, the building materials, to the top. She stands up there and looks out over this project, and she writes in that column, "One day this is going to be the largest and most beautiful park in Washington, a place of magnificence in future administrations." Those were her words, and she had not even yet gone to Japan. So as I'm telling Stephanie, once I read this, I begin to see these are the seeds of the cherry tree idea, because once she saw the trees, she said, "I know a perfect spot to create a cherry tree park." And so that really connected these two stories, and I had to go back and rework the structure of the book, because this told me that the roots of those trees went all the way back to the beginning, really, of Potomac Park. So that became a parallel thread in the story.
And pretty gutsy to go to. I mean, I'm just thinking about that elevator, and I'm getting I'm nervous just thinking about it. She was gutsy.
She was very gutsy.
She was unconventional. What do you think influenced her? I mean, obviously her mother was unconventional.
I think it's personality, for one thing. I think curiosity, and I've already hinted on that from a very, very young age. She was very curious, and she wanted to know the world, as I put it. But I think it was her personality. You could see evidence that I think she must have had a good deal of self-reliance as a young woman growing up in Washington. I think she was fearless. And you can tell this by the fact that she will approach anybody. And I think that she, today we would call her a great networker. She didn't miss an opportunity to connect in some way. And I think I call it in the end of the book, I say, what was it that made her so different? And I think this quality of exuberance. She had such energy and such a sense of engagement with the world around her that I think that was the epitome of her personality.
She also had a lot of important female friendships. And later in life, she talked about the great company of independent spinsters. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, these are the things that it's frustrating as a biographer not to be able to answer. Did she not marry by choice, or did she not marry by circumstances? And I couldn't answer that, but I do know that she moved in a company of many women. Some of her friends were married. She even had, married male friends. But there were quite a few single women whose names I found in different references. And they had a merry little band of socialization right here in Washington. And she had a lot of friends in New York City, very well-connected, socially connected friends, wealthy friends who donated to museums and things like this. So she moved in these circles, but she published a novel late in life, and one of the very few papers that's surviving. Her personal papers were destroyed after her death, but by a relative. But one of the things that survived was an unpublished novel. So there are a lot of autobiographical things in there, and one of them was how she's talking about this merry band of independent women, and spinsters, yeah, merry band of spinsters, and I'm sure that that's her speaking about herself.
Well, one of her female friends, not a spinster, was Mrs. Taft.
Yes, I wouldn't say that we could call them friends, but they were certainly acquaintances. And this was important because Mrs. Taft became the real force behind the cherry trees. If you know the story, Eliza came back from Japan. She puts two and two together. She says, why don't we have these magnificent trees in America? And what better place to do it than in the nation's capital, which is gaining, becoming very popular in the spring for tourism. And I know the perfect spot. So she goes to the men who are building this park and proposes the idea, and they ignored it. They're very conventional. It's the Army Corps of Engineers. They have their ideas of what a public park should be, and it doesn't, they've never seen cherry trees. They can't imagine cherry trees. They're very conventional. So they ignore the idea, and she tries this several times. And Mrs. Taft came to the White House in 1909. She had actually lived in Japan. And the Scidmores knew the Tafts socially, both in Japan and in Washington. So she knew Mrs. Taft. They moved in the same circles. And that is when she heard Mrs. Taft wanted to build a bandstand down along the riverfront to create a public gathering place. Eliza realized this intersected very much with her vision of a cherry tree park. She sent a note to Mrs. Taft, and Mrs. Taft jumped on the idea. And that's when the project finally went forward, because the Army Corps of Engineers couldn't resist the president's wife. So that was the breakthrough, the breakthrough to this barrier up until then. I will say quickly, one of the fun things I found was, this was early in my research, I had seen a reference to Mrs. Taft living in Japan for a short while. So I looking into that, and I find her memoir, and she has a whole chapter devoted to a summer she spent in Japan in the summer of 1900 and dining with Eliza Scidmore's mother. So this is where you begin to see this connection. And she says in the memoir, we met up several times after that, and she's got this wonderful little description of Eliza's mother and how feisty she is. And she called her something about the Queen of the Orient, because she was a great storyteller and people loved visiting her, and so she was a well-known figure in the Far East.
So you've got Mrs. Taft on board, and the trees are coming from Japan. They've been ordered. They're being gifted by Japan, and then you have this dramatic and terrible event. The first batch of trees arrives.
And just to back up a little bit, something I found in my book that's never been reported is that I do believe Eliza Scidmore was actually an intermediary between the Japanese and the Mrs. Taft, because I found two letters that are in my book, two documents that had never been published before. One was a letter of May 12, 1912. She is writing to, the story is that after Mrs. Taft put her imprimatur on this project, Eliza meets up with a Japanese man she knows who's traveling in Washington, a very wealthy chemist. She tells him about Mrs. Taft's plan, and this man, Jokichi Takamine, says, "I'd love to donate 2,000 trees to the project." But then they agreed that it would be better to have the trees come officially from the city of Tokyo to Washington. So that's how it came about. But then when the trees arrived, and then Eliza wrote a note. I found a letter when I went to Japan to do research. She is saying, "I just came from a meeting at the White House with Mrs. Taft, and she would love to accept the gift of the trees." So I believe she was really an intermediary as well as a person who started this whole idea. But then the trees come, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture inspects them and says they're full of pests and diseases. We can't plant these. They will be a threat to U.S. agriculture, and they burned all 2,000 trees. So
I just couldn't believe it when I read that. I was like, really?
Yes, 2,000 trees were burned, and the Japanese were very gracious. They said, "We will send you a replacement batch. They will be grown under pristine conditions. We will have our top horticulturalists supervise the planting and the growing." And that's what they did. Then they sent 3,000 trees, and those are the trees that arrived in 1912 on May 26th, 1912. And the day later, they put the first of those trees in the ground. So those are the trees that we now know that are down alongside the tidal basin. About fewer than 100 of the original ones are surviving, but they've replaced them over the years. But that was the first planting, was March 27th, 1912.
Almost exactly.
112 years ago next week, yeah.
So there are two Japanese words that are important in the story of the cherry blossoms. The first one is sakuru. What's
Sakura.
That? Sakura. What is that?
Cherry blossom, sakura, and from what I understand, it comes from the Japanese words meaning to picnic under the trees, essentially, which was a custom 1,000 years old in Japan, was to go, the trees grew in the mountains and people would go to the mountains. They thought the spirits lived in the trees, so they would go and picnic under the trees and, you know, ask for the blessing for a good harvest, etc. So I believe that's the derivation of the word sakura, something like that. One of them had to do with it meaning the spirits in the trees.
But that sort of relates to hamami.
Hanami.
Hanami.
Hanami or hanami. Yeah, hanami. I
Hanami.
asked Japanese and they said there's really no accent, so it's hard to say it. Hana is the word for flower, and mi is to see. So hanami was this ritual where they would make processions and pilgrimages. They would plant parks of trees and avenues of trees, and for centuries they would make these pilgrimages in the springtime to see the trees in bloom. So this is the derivation of hanami, and I believe this is the vision that Eliza Scidmore had in mind, was to create not just to plant a bunch of these trees, but to create a place where people would come and mingle underneath those trees.
Well, that's such a lovely image, and of course we've been seeing on TV, and that indeed does happen.
That's exactly, and I feel that now when I go down and I walk under those trees, I can feel the idea. I can feel the sense of the idea and where it came from. And in fact, I went to Japan for a month to do research, and there's something in biography, and Stephanie knows this, where biographers say you have to walk in the footsteps of your subject. So I did go to Japan. There were some English newspapers published there. There were records I wanted to try to find. And so I went to Yokohama, and I walked under those trees in the springtime at a park that Eliza Scidmore described in many of her writings, saying, I want to create a mukojima on the Potomac. And the mukojima was a mile-long avenue of cherry trees along the Sumida River in Tokyo, planted in double rows. And so I could see, I could feel, the spirit of what she felt, but also kind of see the inspiration for that idea.
It's such a powerful image, and it's such a gift to the city.
Well, those trees in Japan were eventually destroyed during earthquakes and bombings. So after World War II, the U.S. and Japan had many flower exchanges, dogwoods, but also sending back stock of cherry trees. So there's constantly this exchange going on. So really the U.S. as a friend of Japan, which is what these first trees represented, they made a great ceremony out of giving these trees as an expression of friendship between the United States and Japan, and that was, in 1912. And so that is really the source of the Cherry Blossom Festival, to solidify and remember that friendship. And so part of that is these constant trees exchanges that go on so that they can send genetic stock of the original Japanese cherry trees back to Japan.
So Diana told me that after she wrote this book, she was trying to get it published. That's what we writers like to do. We like to get our book published. She got 30 rejections. Why do you think it was so hard for people to see the value in this work?
Part of it was my original proposal probably wasn't very good. And you do this, you send it out to a few, and then you wait for the response, and then you see what did they say. A lot of them would say it's too regional. One of them said, if this woman hasn't been written about before, she couldn't be that important. So these were some of the responses I was getting. There was actually one, and I'm going to quote in full. I don't think this woman is worthy of a book, and I don't think there's interest to support it. That is the extent of the rejection. So after a while, I had an agent, but then she quit the business, so I was back on my own. And I don't know if you know publishing, but academic publishers, you don't have to have an agent. So I finally ended up getting the book placed with Oxford University, which ended up being good because they got right away that it wasn't just the story of the cherry trees, that it really was an international story as well because of Eliza Scidmore's travels.
But tell us how you got to the Oxford University Press.
So I had reached the point at this time where I was talking to some agents who I'd been referred to, and at least two of them said to me, "It's a great book, but it's really an academic book. You know, it's not a hot story." And I wasn't writing it as a hot story. So I was on my way to Boston one day to visit a friend. I've been a science writer in a lot of my career. I was sitting next to a guy that it turned out he was a science writer in Washington. We talked. He was telling me about his book. I told him about my book, said I was having trouble getting it sold. He said, "You need to talk to my editor at Oxford." He gave me her name. I wrote to her, and 4 days later, she wrote back and said, "Can I send this proposal out for review?" So it was reviewed by 3 academic reviewers, and all 3 gave it a thumbs up. So it just goes to show.
Yeah, it's fortuitous.
It is fortuitous.
So what would you say is Eliza Scidmore's most lasting legacy? Is it the trees, or is it something more, or is it both?
I think, well, definitely we can say her most visible or tangible legacy is the trees, but I also like to think that her legacy is the cultural understanding, because she was writing at a time when Americans barely left their backyards. You know, think about it, right after the Civil War. She was writing about places that most Americans would never see in their lifetimes. And so that was important for places like Alaska, but it was also, of course, countries across the Pacific that were becoming important to America around the turn of the century. She wrote books on Japan, Java, China, India. The China connection in particular was one of the biggest surprise findings in the book, because I had no idea going into it that I knew she wrote a book on China. I didn't expect to focus a lot of attention on it because of the length. I couldn't. But when I got into it, it was stunning. I found lots of letters to her editor at the New York Public Library in New York that talked about her travels in Japan, and how she has her finger on the pulse of things that are happening in Japan, and that they're going through. You know, this is the Boxer Rebellion. Her book came out the summer of the Boxer Rebellion. They were going to publish it in the fall, and because of the Boxer Rebellion, they bumped the date up, and it came out that same summer. And so I eventually, once I looked into this, I found some scholars, 2 scholarly articles that said she is considered one of a handful of traveler writers who opened Japan to mass tourism in the late 19th century. So this was a part of her life I didn't even know. So I think this is a great deal of her legacy, is this cross-cultural understanding.
Are there any important scenes that I've left out that you want to tell us about, or any?
Oh, there are some fun scenes. The one I told you about, the train. There is the story of her and her mother climbing Mount Fuji was a lot of fun.
Tell us more about that.
They go to climb Mount Fuji, and she's got quite a lengthy section on it. It's great fun because she she describes everything in such detail, and how they're traveling. There are about 8 or 10 Westerners, and they're all traveling with porters. And she says, all the women were given 2 porters, or maybe 3, because she said their job was to haul us up the mountain and haul us back down. And literally they were, the ropes around the belt, tugging and the whole thing. They go up the mountain, and she's describing what the pilgrimages are like. And they have 10 pilgrim stations, and you would stop at each one. And then they get 3/4 of the way up, and then this huge cloudburst moves in, and they end up in a little hut, and they're trapped there for 3 days, and there are 42 people in this hut on the mountain. And she's describing, the smoke, and how the cook has to cook for all of them, and how she's watching him shave little pieces of fish and mushroom and mixing it with soil and a big pot of rice. 3 days they're trapped here. And then they come back down the mountain, and on the way, the rain comes back, and there's this scene where she takes her dress and she abandons her dress. She says, I hung it as a flag, and she wrapped herself in a blanket and went the rest of the way down the mountain.
That'll work in the movie.
That'll work in a movie. So it was just great fun to read her writings, because her personality came through in so much in her books.
Yeah. She sounds like she was fun.
Somebody fun to hang around with.
Yeah. One thing we haven't talked about is National Geographic.
Yes.
The connection to the National Geographic.
Yeah, so she went to Alaska, I already mentioned, in 1883. She took a trip to Alaska by steamer, and her inspiration was John Muir. He had gone to Alaska in the summers of 1879, 1880 to study glaciers. And when he went, he hired some local Native Alaskans, and they paddled around in a canoe. So he writes about it, and he's really the first, white person to write a lot about Alaska, and she's inspired by his writing, so she goes, and she takes a steamer. It's the only way to go, a mail steamer, 1,000 miles up the Inside Passage. But that summer, something unusual happened, because the captain took a detour, and instead of going north and then turning around and coming south, he took a detour over to what later became Glacier Bay. And her ship went up into the north of Glacier Bay, and it was the first time sightseers had ever done that. So she wrote about that. So she impressed the scientists at National Geographic, which had just been founded. This was a few years later. She wrote on Alaska she took about a half dozen trips to Alaska and became really a recognized expert on Alaska. So she joined the National Geographic in 1890. 2 years after it was founded, and in 1892 then, they elected her corresponding secretary, which made her the first woman on the board. And she went on this. So she's now a friend of people like, Alexander Graham Bell and his family. One of his son-in-laws became her editor at the Geographic, and another one became a colleague on the cherry trees. So she was really a colleague of many eminent scientists at the Geographic, and she went on to write about a dozen articles for them. And she also took photographs and collected photographs at a time when the magazine was switching to a very heavy pictorial format, starting around 1905.
Yeah, she had a Kodak.
She had a Kodak, and a lot of the reviewers of her books would say that her writings were like Kodaks, her descriptions were like Kodaks, yeah. And I found the records of when she took up photography, apparently around 1890. She's writing a letter to an editor and said, I'm on my way to Glacier Bay. I expect to see John Muir. He's working there this summer. I want to profile him for the magazine. And by the way, I can get his picture against the Arctic scenery, because she was carrying a box camera, and it had only been introduced about 2 years earlier. So from that point on, she's traveling with a camera. Newspapers and magazines weren't yet running photographs, but they would take those photographs, turn them into woodcuts and line drawings, and illustrate her articles. And then the Smithsonian even lent her camera equipment, and she had a contact at the National History Museum, National Museum, it was called at the time. They lent her equipment and film, and there are about 200 to 300 of her photos at the Smithsonian, and they're online. You can actually go online and see them.
It's a remarkable career, and I think I have this right. She was a freelancer the entire time.
She
never had a
she
steady-
wasn't on staff. She wrote for many. She started off in newspapers, and then she wrote for one newspaper 10 years, and then some others as well, like a half a dozen other newspapers. Then she switched to magazines once she started traveling in Japan. And she wrote for these magazines many years. And then she would take the magazine articles and turn them into books, chapters into books. And she also, for a while, was subsidized by the Canadian Pacific Railway because she took some of her material and wrote a guidebook for the railway. So they paid for some of her travel expenses. So you could see just how enterprising she was and how industrious.
And when she died, she chose to be buried in Japan.
No, she actually, she left the country in 1920, right around the 1920s, because, as you probably know, we were getting into the anti-Japanese laws in American immigration. She was furious. She was a big fan of Japan. She was a big defender of Japan. And Japan, just to very quickly, had gone to war with China in 1895 and beat China. And this was shocking to the world, that this tiny country had become so modern in 50 years that it was able to defeat Japan. And then 10 years later, they went to war with Russia and beat Russia. So now the world is terrified of Japan. And so we're beginning to see a lot of the discrimination laws, and she was a big defender of Japan through a lot of this. And so when they passed the anti-immigration immigration laws in 1924, she was outraged, and she left the country. She said she was going to move to Europe, and she ended up in Geneva.
Geneva, that's right.
Because she was a fan of the League of Nations, and they were based there, and that's where she died. And I did find her will down here at the D.C. courthouse, a copy of her will, where she says in her will she wants her ashes to be scattered to the wind. But some family and some friends approached the family and said, we would like to send her ashes to Japan because her mother and brother were buried there. So her ashes are now in Yokohama at a cemetery there. And the lovely end to that story is that a group of Japanese go to her gravesite twice a year to pay tribute every year during cherry blossom season, and again at the anniversary of her death, they go to her grave.
And I assume you've been there.
I went there during my trip to Japan, yeah.
Well, maybe that's a good place to ask if anyone has any questions or anything they'd want to know more about.
Would you talk a little bit about the cherry trees outside the park, the ones in Northwest? And
Yes, the Japanese sent 3,000, a little over 3,000, like 3,020 trees. And those trees were 12 varieties of trees. So they weren't, the ones that we see on the mall, the white fluffy trees, are a variety called Yoshino. Those have become really popular in Japan because after they lost a lot of their trees, they lost a lot of that variety. And these Yoshinas caught on in Japan because, as you know, I mean, they're just so beautiful. But when the Japanese then sent the second batch, they went to a site that had cultivated something like 75 varieties of cherry trees along a particular riverbank. And they sent those trees here. 1,800 of them were the Yoshino, and they were planted around the tidal basin. These other trees they planted at different spots around the city, Rock Creek Park. There's a wonderful specimen on the Library of Congress grounds. It's still there, held out. And this is remarkable because a typical cherry tree lasts 40 to 50 years. And these trees, there are fewer than 100 that are still the original trees, which is remarkable. And that's thanks to the maintenance and the care of the Park Service. But so the National Arboretum also, I'm told, has something like 75 varieties of cherry trees. I was just talking to somebody last week, and that they are constantly cultivating varieties, but they're propagating varieties all the time. Any other questions?
Did she travel with companions?
She did, almost always early in her career. She will say, "My friend and I," or something to that effect. She doesn't identify who those people are. So I've been able to kind of read between the lines and know that occasionally it was her mother, sometimes it was friends. As a younger reporter, she would have had to have an escort. Later in life, I don't think she did, although she hired local people to accompany her, and there was one where she's going to Peking. That was her favorite city in Asia. She's going to Peking, and she's traveling with, I think, a young Japanese assistant or something. She found him so annoying, she sent him home. So I don't know. But she would have hired people along the way, and at times did travel with companions.
What did your research show you about her relationship with Dr. Fairchild, who's also given credit for bringing the cherry blossoms here, along with her? They share it.
Yes, this is a very delicate question, and it almost always comes up because over the years there's been a controversy. Was she the one that initiated the idea, or did David Fairchild? So I researched this pretty thoroughly, going back to the records. David Fairchild was Alexander Graham Bell's son-in-law, so Eliza knew him personally. And he also traveled to Java and knew Eliza and respected Eliza for her plant knowledge. He was a botanist, and he became what's called a plant explorer. He traveled around the world looking for new varieties of plants to import to the United States. He independently discovered cherry blossoms in Japan around 1902 on one of his trips. He never saw trees in bloom, from what I'm told. All he saw were the blooms, these illustrations, these beautiful watercolors of the blooms, and he said they are exquisite. So he ordered about 125 trees of 5 different varieties, imported them and planted them at his home north of Chevy Chase to see how well they would grow in this area, and they did magnificently. So he started pushing cherry trees for the streets of Washington, and he actually did a publicity campaign in like 1908. And so at this point, they were working together. I found information that he said, but it was not until 20 years later. The idea originated in the Woods, which is the name of his estate, during a visit by Miss Scidmore. So this told me, but then there was, I think, a falling out, because I found evidence showing they approached the White House and the Army Corps of Engineers at the same time. So Eliza had approached them before, and they'd rejected her. He came back and approached them. It was a letter of like April 5th, I don't know, something like that, April 5th, saying to the Army Corps of Engineers, I want to donate 50 trees to create an avenue of trees. In the meantime, Eliza is approaching Mrs. Taft saying, would you support the planting of trees along the river? And Mrs. Taft writes back to Eliza. I think then when the trees were planted 3 years later, 3 people were invited to witness that planting as guests of Mrs. Taft. It was the ambassador of Japan, his wife, and Eliza Scidmore. I think there was some bad blood there. I think, and I say in my book, because I don't know, were they working in cooperation or in competition? I don't know that, but in the end, I suspect that they were both seeing each other as infringing on their interests in their territory or whatever, but in the end, neither of them ever mentioned much about the other's role. So there's still some debate on that, but I did track down quite a few records that suggests they initially started out as partners and then something fell through.
And do you believe that on the golf course over on Haynes Point, do you believe that some of the original trees are there? You do?
Yes, I did find that, and this is the story, is that when they burned those 2,000 trees, the story is, and it was based on a newspaper report at the time, they said that some of those buggy trees, as they called them, were held in reserve and planted over around Haynes Point because they wanted to be able to study them over the years. It was reported about 10 or 15 years ago that these apparently, they did the genetic tests and all, and said they really did think these were some of the remaining trees from that period.
Are cherry trees native to the United States, or do they have to come from Japan?
Well, we of course have fruit cherry trees, and the ornamental trees in Japan do actually bear fruit, but it's a puny little kind of fruit. I've talked to a woman here in town who's an expert, Anne McClellan, and she says there are genetic differences. That the Japanese trees, and in fact, the Japanese trees, cherry trees are not just native to Japan. That they grew in the mountains around Southeast Asia in other countries. But the Japanese were the ones that really took up cherry trees. The Chinese had been doing this with like plum blossom trees for years. So the Japanese took up a great interest in Japanese cherry trees and made them very much a part of their national identity, planting them and creating traditions around them. But we had cherry trees in around the mid-1900s because individuals would import them either for their own private gardens or for study or for arboretums. So there were individual trees in America at the time. And David Fairchild, his trees predated the ones on the mall, but they had never been done in a park setting, which is what we got. And I think that was the influence of Eliza Scidmore, this idea of creating a park that imitated parks in Japan.
So there's a fruit-bearing cherry tree and the ornamental cherry trees, and we're talking about ornamental cherry trees.
Yes, we are talking about ornamental cherry tree. That's what we call them now, or cherry blossom trees to distinguish them. Yeah.
Is there a question? Okay, I'll be right there.
You mentioned her taking photos. Are there many photos of her?
No, there are very few photos of her. There is a portrait of her, a studio portrait of her. It was taken in around, I think, 1893, because she went to the World's Fair in Chicago that summer. And she got a contract to speak through a speaking bureau. And I think that was her publicity photo. So that's really the only photo we have of her. But there is one in the book that I love dearly, and it's a picture of her at the age of 20. And you see her, it was taken at a studio out west when she took this trip I was telling you about, and it was taken at a studio in the Dakota Territory. And I think it must have been taken maybe to celebrate her 21st birthday. And it is my favorite picture of her. It's one of the few pictures of her, but it just shows this young woman. You can see in this portrait of her, kind of her personality. Later, there were very few, there may be some out there, I haven't found them yet. There is one newspaper photo of her and Mrs. Taft together a week before the cherry tree planting. It was taken in New York when Eliza went to lecture on cherry trees at the Japan Society. Mrs. Taft came up with her sister to tour that exhibit. So the newspapers have a picture of the two of them. The quality isn't very good, but at least it showed me a picture. It is in the book as well, a picture of the two of them a week before they met up along the tidal basin for the planting of the first trees.
Okay.
Well, Stephanie Deutsch, Diana Parsell, thank you both so much for being with us this afternoon. Once again, East City Bookshop, our neighbor, wonderful independent shop is here selling books, and Diana will be signing them. So thank you all very much for coming. Please come back, and thank you both.